and be the discussant of this session. Let me start now recording. All right. So for those who are connecting right now who might not know me, my name is Indraccolo. I will be chairing this session. I'm also the discussant for our next session, which is called Pre-Imperial and Early Imperial Legacies. We have 3 speakers. We're going to have papers, and right after my response and time for questions. And I will start immediately by introducing our first speaker, Professor Yuri from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And his paper today is entitled Class Traitors, the Assault on the Intellectuals' Power in the Book of Lord Chang and Hanfeizi. Yuri, the floor is yours, and I will just brutally tell you when it's about 18 minutes after you start.
Thank you very much. I hope that now you can see my screen, and let us go. Now, I am very lucky to speak immediately after Fu Yang, because Fu Yang represented already very well Professor Yu Yingshi, and I will start with one of Professor Yu's early articles, penned at the end of the Cultural Revolution, which you can understand the background, when Professor Yu Yingshi discussed the anti-intellectualism in Chinese political tradition. He focused primarily on the anti-intellectualism in politics and on the suppression of intellectuals by the state. Now, my point is a little bit different. I want to ask why during the heyday of the Warring States period, when you have the 100 school of thought, the intellectual freedom, freedom of expression, everything, why then, and exactly then, we have the intellectuals who want to suppress other intellectuals? The intellectuals who betray their class. I'm sure that Professor Yu would not use this kind of term, but this was a class betrayal. And I want to focus primarily on the thinkers whom are very, very often identified as legalists. I think that Paul Goldin convinced me that not to use this term, so we now use the Fa tradition. Maybe it is a little bit more accurate. Why they were and what did they want to gain by attack on the intellectuals. But let us start with a very brief reminder. I'm sure that most of you know the story, the rise of the Shin. Not all the Shin were intellectuals from the beginning, I warn you, but all the intellectuals of whom we know identified themselves as Shin. And the rise of the Shin, of this group of people, men of service, it was a phenomenal event during the Warring States period. The small group or marginal group of the lower aristocracy suddenly rises and encompasses the erstwhile aristocracy, becomes the new ruling elite. And parallel to this, she convinced everybody that they have the ideological expertise, that if you want to know what is proper answer to any question, it is not the ruler's court, it is not the courtiers, it is us, the masters and their disciples, and we know everything. And this is immensely powerful stratum, very proud of itself, and engenders very haughty, proud discourse. Just employ us, and all the problems will be solved. You can see it from the Liu Shiqun. It is one of this kind of endless propaganda, the self-campaigning, the PR campaign of the Shi of the Warring States period. First of all, we are the best. We put aside life. She are those men, not some of us, just all of us. We put aside life to follow righteousness and consider death as returning home, etc., etc., etc. And look, the ruler of a state will not be able to befriend them. The Son of Heaven will not be able to make them servants. What we shall contribute, at best, stabilization of all under heaven, or at least stabilization of a single state. So just employ us. I think that you understood the point very well, and you can understand exactly why many thinkers dislike this, because it was such a brazen, self-serving propaganda. So I will not go to the Fa tradition. I will start with Xunzi. Xunzi faced the attack by the King Zhao of Qin, asked him, "Are you Confucians useless for the state?" So Xunzi did not like it. He explained that we are very useful, but all the rest are useless. All the rest are bad. All the rest do not deserve anything. You can see all these thinkers which play about the names, Lisa's friends, Gongsun Long, and all the rest. All these are completely useless, guy. You don't need to understand what they say because it is of no use. But they're not just useless. Some of them are really bad. Some of them really undermine the order. What can we do about this Shen Dao and Mozi and all the rest? Ideally, we should not allow them to advance their talks. But who should suppress them? And here it is a Confucian take. Xunzi says, yes, ideally the sage monarch must prohibit these vile talks, vile theories. But you know, sage monarchs are exception. These are the monarchs who will unify all under heaven. They will come sometimes. Yes, these were the great founders of the past dynasties, but currently we don't have a sage monarch. So currently, when we don't have a sage monarch, it is a task of myself, the great Confucian, a nobleman. I don't have the positional power to control them, but at least I shall use my argumentative persuasions. And it is what exactly Xunzi does throughout his book. He attacks many of the intellectuals, but he is very conscious to preserve the autonomy of the intellectuals. We shall suppress the rest, but we shall not allow the power holder to intervene into this suppression. Okay. Now, after this very brief introduction, let us go to the real stuff. And the real stuff, it is my good friend Shang Yang, Lord Shang. The book, of course, not written only by him, but by some of his disciples. And let us start with one of the most appalling statements, which alienates everybody. You know, the parasites, rights and music. Okay, we shall live without rights and music, no problem. Poems and documents, we can also live without them. But look, self-cultivation and goodness, filiality and fraternal duties, sincerity and trustworthiness, all these moral ideals, they are parasites. They should be uprooted from the state. Now, I think that all of you feel uneasy about this statement, and believe me that almost everybody in the Warring States period and beyond felt as uneasy as you are feeling when you have this comprehensive assault on anything. And Su Shi, who was mentioned in the first session, he mentioned that, yeah, the scholars are ashamed to speak about Shang Yang. But now when you go into the book of Lord Shang, this alienating rhetoric is not the most important point. It is not that Shang Yang is against benevolence and righteousness. In the same chapter from which the citation comes, he says, yes, the final goal is benevolence and righteousness. But what he did not like are those self-serving intellectuals who are utilizing the moralizing discourse to promote themselves. And why he did not like them? Because here I go to historical Shang Yang, he created the great idea that in order to make a rich and powerful state, everybody must be engaged in agriculture and warfare. And in order to give the push to people to engage in these very unpleasant tasks, we need to allocate all the social, material, and political benefits only to those who till and fight. And the intellectuals, they are useless. They don't till, they don't fight. Now, when 1,000 people are engaged in agriculture and warfare, and suddenly somebody comes who is engaged in poems and documents, argumentativeness and cleverness, then 1,000 people all will become remiss in agriculture and warfare. They will be distracted. Actually, I think that this statement is the greatest statement about the power of intellectuals to change everything, to change everybody. One intellectual will change 1,000 tillers and fighters. But of course, for Shang Yang, it is the problem. The problem that intellectuals are, A, distract the people from their really useful task, be, they're unrulable. It is very difficult to control them. They go from one state to another. They are not fixed on their land like the peasants. So this is the problem. And by the very fact that they are unruly and socially redundant, and that they distract the people from agriculture and warfare, they weaken the state. The people abandon their superiors, and those who do not behave as subjects become more and more numerous. This is not the way to empower the state. But Shang Yang and the other contributors to his book, they did not pay much attention to what the intellectuals say. The intellectuals as a group, as a social phenomenon, they're redundant, they're bad. And it is funny, of course, because Shang Yang was neither tiller nor soldier. Remember that the authors of the book of Lord Shang were intellectuals who tried very hard to convince the ruler that intellectuals are completely useless. It's one of these paradoxes. But let us go now to the major focus of my discussion, which is Han Fei. Han Fei. Han Fei is not as brilliant a political thinker as Shang Yang. Paul Goldin said in a very provocatively that Han Fei is more a derivative thinker, and I think it is very true. Han Fei is not the great thinker, but he is the best analyst. He is merciless. He unveils all this selfishness and manipulativeness of all his rivals. And he hates these scholars, students of the text, Confucians and so-called Confucians and Mohists who are actually, Yixin Mian explained it very well. It is not Confucians and nor Mohists. It is all the moralizers. The moralizers are bad. First, just like Shang Yang, Han Fei reminds us, they're useless. The state needs those who fight. The armored Shi, the real Shi who were armored, the soldiers, not the intellectuals. And these useless guys, why should we patronize them? Now, why they are useless, Shang Yang never discussed it in depth. Han Fei does it. He explains, first, the stupid Confucians and Mohists and whatever moralizers, they're attracted to the past, to the legacy of the former kings. But the former kings, their time is bygone. There is nothing to do about them. Just forget about them. It is stupid to engage in the discussions about their legacy. Second, the abuse of these subtle and mysterious words that normal people cannot understand. It is again useless. And third, you know, all those who speak about morality, and I think it is very valid observation, they have these lofty principles, and on these lofty principles, it is very difficult to compromise, and then you attack each other with these lofty principles instead of discussing practical things which can be solved. You know very well now that if the vaccination or the masks are becoming the point of the freedom of human beings, etc., then you cannot compromise. If you discuss it in terms of effectiveness, yes, you can find some viable solution. So Han Fei says these contradictions, they are useless principles, they are motley and contradictory teachings that are simply completely redundant. Just forget about it. We don't need them. But it is not only step number one. Step number two is much more interesting. Step number two is to say, all the moralizers are serving their selfish needs. First of all their morality that they teach, like the filial piety, okay, it is very good for one individual to take care of his father. But what happens if this individual must go to the army? Should he abscond from the battlefield in order to take care of his parent? Then of course we know a filial son to a father is an absconding subject to the ruler. But it is just one small example. What really matters is the engagement of intellectuals in self-promotion by using this discourse of worthiness. They create a parallel system of values in which their brilliance and their lofty behavior become more important than their actual contribution to the state. And when you have this parallel system of values, it erodes political power. And this what Hanfei is concerned. And he speaks, look, he doesn't want to call them sheep. He says them people, ordinary men. They have their private interests, but the sovereign is concerned with common benefit. The common is the ruler, the state. They are representing the common interests, not the private interests of these self-serving intellectuals. Of course, this guy, they don't want to work. They want to sustain themselves. They don't want to serve, but they want to have their name illustrious. These are the people who undermine the state power. And because of their existence, you can see that the entire political system is weakened, because you have all these sages and knowledgeable people. They multiply, they produce speeches and create statements, and they undermine the standards and the laws which are implemented from above. They rely on their illustrious reputation, and the villains, the really bad guys, benefit. And what is worse, because the seductiveness of this intellectual discourse, stupid rulers heed the intellectuals' arguments, and they accept the correctness of these arguments, and then they don't suppress the intellectuals, and then the power of the ruler becomes weaker and weaker, and he cannot overcome his underlings. Now, this is already bad enough, but Hanfei is not satisfied with this. He goes one step further. He goes to one of the most brilliant chapters in the entire corpus of the Warring States texts. This is chapter Loyalty and Filiality, which originally was Hanfei's memorial to the ruler. He borrows the moralizers' discourse to undermine their ideals. He says, okay, everybody speaks about filiality and fraternity, so nice, and loyalty and compliance, excellent. And everybody speaks about Yao and Shun and Kings Tang and Wu. What did these kings do? They attained the power of their superiors, either through abdication or through rebellion. In any case, they undermined the overarching principle of monarchic rule. These people use their discourse of worthiness. They always say, yes, Yao and Shun, they were so great. Shun was so worthy. And King Tang and King Wu were so worthy. Of course, you use this discourse of worthiness to seize the ruler's power, just like it was in the state of Qi, where the Tian family usurped power, in the state of Song when it was done by the Dai lineage. So when people speak about worthy and intelligent people, they actually benefit the usurpers. So discard the discourse of worthiness. And if it is not enough, Hanfei, he likes to provoke his opponents. Now he speaks about Shun. Shun, as you know, everybody read Mengzi. Shun is considered by Mengzi the paragon of filiality. Now we know that Shun is not really filial, because he became the ruler during the period when his biological father was still alive. So he became the ruler over his father, which is a very problematic situation for a good Confucian. Mengzi did not like this situation and tried to say, no, Shun was very filial, Shun was the best. Shun liked his father, even though the father was a bad guy. Now, what Hanfei says? Guso was Shun's father, but Shun expelled him. Xiang was his younger brother, but Shun killed him. But it is not enough. Look, Shun, outside his home, made his ruler into a subject. Yao was his ruler, became his subject. Inside, he made his father a servant and a mother into a Xie. Xie is either female bondservant or concubine. Now, you can make it a female bondservant as in a compound Chen Xie. If you look the previous sentence, he spoke about making his father into a Chen. But you can make it a concubine as a Qi Xie. And the next sentence speaks about his making two daughters of Yao into his wives. So Hanfei implies here, he hints here, that Shun actually, as Paul Goldin tried to show in one of his articles, copulated with his biological mother. And you can understand exactly how good Confucians reacted to this.
On this high note, it's 18 minutes.
Okay, excellent. I shall finish in time. And then Hanfei finishes. He explains Why this discourse is done? This discourse is done to undermine the ruler's power. Because when somebody praises somebody else's father, it is to criticize his own father. When the Confucians and the Mohists praise former kings, it is done to malign their rulers. And then we come to the conclusion. You should outlaw this discourse. One subject should not praise the worthiness of Yao and Shun, should not extol the punitive expeditions of Tang and Wu, should not talk of the loftiness of zealous men of service, the purists. It is conclusion number one. Conclusion number two, just eliminate all the intellectuals' autonomy, absorb them into officialdom. No need in the text written in books on the bamboo strips. The law is the teaching. No discourses of the former monarchs. The officials are the teachers. And this is exactly what, of course, Yixin will do after several years thereafter. And all of you know I will not discuss it. I want to use the last minute for the conclusion. Why the far traditions supporters betrayed their class? It is sure that they alienated everybody. Just think about anybody who will say, okay, all these humanities, they are A, useless, B, subversive. And if it is said by one of the distinguished colleagues, we shall not like this colleague very much. So the intellectuals back then did not like Shang Yang and Han Fei very much. So why this is done? You can say to ingratiate yourself with the ruler, but I'm afraid to do this, you don't need to publish. You just need to say your secret memorial to the ruler, it will be enough. But they did not do it. I think they did not do it because they were really committed to the idea that everybody pursued. We want a powerful state, a monarchic order, so we should be consistent. And to be consistent, we can say we don't want intellectuals. So actually, we can say that these bad guys whom everybody hates, Shang Yang and Han Fei, were really representing the common goal, whereas all these moralizers like Menzi were actually very selfish self-promoters. This is a possible explanation. But I know that if I finish with this slide, you will hate me, and I will finish with another slide to show the price. And there was a price. When you abandon the intellectuals, when you discard the intellectuals, you remain alone. And you can rely on the ruler's patronage only. But as everybody, every reader of Han Fei, and of course, every reader of Sebestyen knows, even if the ruler patronizes you and heeds you and gives you everything, it is valid only when this ruler is alive. And the moment this changes, you remain alone, the lone rider. And without the support of other intellectuals, you will never be able to create a viable political ideology. You will never be able to create a school. You will never be able to gain legitimacy intellectual. And it is not accidental that even in our workshop, so many people will spoke and will speak about Confucians and Confucians and Confucians, whereas the most brilliant political thinkers in human history, authors of the Book of Lord Shang and Han Fei, they are usually dismissed because they are so much irritating us, the intellectuals. We don't like class traitors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yuri. And I will immediately move on to some comments. And as I said, I actually have more questions now, but I will limit myself so that we have a few minutes also for the audience to ask some questions. So, well, I had the opportunity to read your much longer, richer paper, which I really enjoyed reading. I was very happy, of course, to see that you started exactly by talking with you about Yixin, because it connected so well with the previous panel. I think you did, as usual, a great contextualization, of course, of the situation of the Shi, the rise of the Shi, and the gradual somehow increasing their intellectual arrogance and boldness to a certain point, and of course their progressive decline in prestige in the moment in which everybody is sure, everybody is promoting themselves without actually having the refined skills that we would expect a proper intellectual to have. So it's a very mixed situation where we have proper intellectuals also fighting for service, promoting themselves with good grounds, and others that are absolutely, just as you define them so nicely, zealous men of service, which I think is fantastic definition. I really like that you also brought together the Shanzhenshu, of course, perspective, which is much more pragmatic and underlines this fact that the intellectuals are not necessarily a negative element, they're just useless, so we should get rid of them because they are impractical somehow, they're just getting in the way, they really don't contribute anything. While of course Feizo focuses more on the subversive nature of this moralizing discourse, how much it really has a negative influence. And of course you then have all this very interesting discourse about that starts about how we actually are we actually able to distinguish a worthy shir to employ? How do we do that? And of course, we go on to this point where you actually contextualize the shir as a potential problem to social political order. So somehow the criticism also of that Feizo could have constructed as a criticism of adversaries, it actually becomes a more consistent criticism of intellectual freedom to a certain extent. But I will not take more time, and I will just ask you probably the most provocative questions. So I was thinking when I was reading your text, there are, of course, when we're talking about the far references to legal codes, norms, regulations. So if we look also at later legal codes, punishments reserved to those who scheme against the empire, which is also a theme that you addressed, are considered to be much more serious. They are handled and punished with more harshly than other crimes that are comparable in terms of severity. And that seems to be consistent with the word you described as it was envisioned already in legalist writings, especially when it comes to Hompot and Yixin. So what strikes me is there seems to be much more continuity. If we look also at the actual legal prescription between the Shin and the Han, that the tradition would like us to think, and probably we ourselves would like to think, and also this uniformity of the class of scholar officials from the ideological and intellectual point of view that is established, of course, together with the progressive centralization of the empire. So my question is, how legalist do you think was the early empire? And is eventually the case that an empire has to be somewhat legalist to be self-sufficient and long-lasting? And that's already two very big questions.
Yes, it's a very big question, but let me try to answer it briefly. First of all, I don't like not only the term legalist, I don't like this division into schools of thought, because I think that what characterized mostly the intellectual discourse of the Warring States period, that despite all the differences, they had common points. And the common point was, yes, all of us want to have unified empire. B, all of us want to have one single emperor above. C, all of us want to have a rich and powerful state. Why not, actually? Who would oppose this? There were on the margins. And the so-called legalists, they were simply more straightforward, and they presented very efficient ways. But and these ways, of course, were incorporated into the imperial DNA from the Qin dynasty and well into our days. Surely, this is not debatable. But their openness, their open denigration of fellow intellectuals, it creates very bad situation at the top of the power, because the ruler cannot be surrounded only by the servitors. He must be surrounded also by some critical-minded advisors. If you have only yes men, you will not advance. I think Sebestyen made it excellently in the biography of Shang Yang, and I think that it is still the motto. It was used recently to criticize Xi Jinping by one of the party leaders. So it's a kind of a very important observation. If you want to utilize the intellectuals, you must give them some freedom of expression, not too much because it will be dangerous, but you must give them dignity. You must respect them. So all the emperors, when they went to Confucius' temple, it's not because they really admired Confucius as a great thinker. He was not. But they knew that all the intellectuals are so proud to have this guy who was our forefather, who told that we are noble men, that we are morally superior, and that is why we deserve all the benefits from the state. The emperor knew, I will give it to Confucius. All the intellectuals will like me, and why should I alienate and suppress them in the harsh way of this? So the DNA was maybe, if you want to call it legalist DNA, but all the rest was still very much Confucian.
Thank you so much, Yuri. And I think we can take 5 minutes for questions from the audience. So if anyone has, we have already one. So please, Martina, you go ahead.
Oh, yeah, so my question, I hope it's going to be provocative enough to match the topic. So, you know, on the one hand, Han Fei criticizes this sort of political anachronism, referring, you know, to and idealizing these ancient rulers like Yao and Shin. And it's partly because, as you said, that he saw it as subversive, disruptive activity. But part, I believe, because he deemed the practices of these legendary rulers to be obsolete, not up to date with the changing times, changing living conditions, etc. And so I wonder, you know, that perhaps Han Fei is actually guilty of the same sin, you know, of not recognizing the zeitgeist of promoting a model of governance that was impossible to uphold in times where the diversity of voices, intellectual pluralism has been already too advanced to contain it. So just to put it shortly, maybe Han Fei hasn't recognized the spirit of the times.
Wow, what a great question. You know, it's an excellent angle, and I think that it may be correct, but I think that Han Fei would say that yeah, the time is not. We still have an opportunity to suppress them, and his fellow student and his nemesis Lise advanced not badly into this direction. Luckily, not too much, but still, it's a very good point. I agree with you. I think that Professor Yu Shi would also agree with you. After the Cultural Revolution, which did so much to suppress intellectuals, they still came to the top and actually subverted the legacy of the Cultural Revolution. So yes, you are right from our point of view. Han Fei might have been right from his point of view.
Thank you so much. And I have Federico and then Hilda.
Yes, thank you, Yuri, so much as always for your inspiring paper. You know that I very, I like a lot the fast school. I'm very interested in the fast school. But my question for you is, do you think there is also a biographical background that explains this attitude towards the intellectuals? I'm not referring necessarily to Han Fei, but to the authors maybe of these texts, in the sense that probably they lacked the kind of social leverage, even if they were intellectuals, that other currents enjoyed. So of course they could only enjoy some kind of leverage provided by the state. So do you think that this is something that make them different from other so-called schools or currents or other thinkers that maybe had a stronger kind of role in the local communities, for example, that these thinkers, on the contrary, lacked? And maybe this is linked to the fact that some of them were transplanted in other contexts, linked to the migration within the warring states. I was curious to know your opinion on this.
It's a fascinating question, but we don't have enough materials to answer. Actually, Han Fei and Shang Yang, what is common among them, both of them were nobles, were from the high nobility, but none of them identified himself with the nobles. Actually, Shang Yang did everything he could to destroy the very possibility that hereditary nobility will exist after his death. I don't think that we can estimate what was the local appeal of any of the thinkers of the Warring States period, because we don't have enough materials. It is just, we'll be engaged in guessing. It's not a bad idea, what you suggest, but let me answer. I think that even if Han Fei or Shang Yang or the contributors to their books would have a power to generate some support from below, they would not use this power because they were against the idea of the political action from below. Everything must be top down. They did not want it. So it's maybe because, not because they did not have the possibility, because they did not want the possibility. At least ideologically, I don't know what was in their mind. Nobody can know, of course.
And thank you so much. And then Hilde, and then we will move on to our next speaker. Please,
all right,
Hilde.
just a quick question. Yes, a great paper, Yuri, and I see a lot of the attacks on the legalists in the Song as sort of falling within this category as well. And what I would like to do is to pose a question, or perhaps an alternative reason why perhaps the Fa was the Fa and not the Fa Tia, from a Neo-Confucian perspective. And that is to say that, could we perhaps say that they were unable to create perhaps more support for themselves, not only because they were dependent on unreliable patronage, and not only because they were without the support of peer intellectuals, but also perhaps to sort of look at perhaps what they themselves could have done, and that is that they didn't necessarily seem to have created an alternative position for themselves, or a social category.
Can you speak a little bit louder?
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, yes, much
okay.
better.
So my suggestion then would be that is to look at some of the terminology that you use to sort of describe this category of intellectuals, the Suedre or the Suersche. And one of the things that the Neo-Confucians do, and I think quite successfully, is that they define themselves, they present themselves as the Suedre, as those who learn. And they oppose that to merely social position. They're not Tafu or Shatafu or just Shuren, they're the Suedre. And this term carries a lot of weight by the 13th century. And so the question that raises is that we could sort of say, well, maybe what they didn't do, the Shangyangs and the Lises and Hanfeis of this world, is to adopt a terminology like that would also make them an identifiable alternative to the Suesche or the Suedre that they were attacking. So could we put the blame, in other words, you could say, could we put the blame on them rather than just sort of blaming the patrons and the peer intellectuals?
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. This is actually what I tried to, I skipped it because of the time, but you gave me this opportunity. They did not want to create, they did not act to create a school. They did not act to create a corpus of ideas that should be theirs. They were too much committed to the centralization, to the top-down process, but they did not try to create any intellectual alternative, which will be as appealing as the alternatives promoted by their rivals. And I think that it is, okay, maybe it is good, because not all of us would like to live in the country which is ruled according to the ideas of my good friend, Lord Shang. But this is actually their tragedy. That is why they were not totalitarians. They did not try to create this totalitarian ideologies that everybody must recite our writings and then everybody will advance because they recited our writings. I think that if we go to the Song dynasty, your field, Wang and Shi was much cleverer, and even he failed after all by creating some kind of uniform ideology which will give the people the answers, how to understand the texts, what to reply, how to analyze. Neither Shangyang nor Hanfei even try to do this. And this is one of the reasons for their decline in the next 20 centuries, well into our days.
Thank you so much, Yuri, for this wonderful talk. Thanks everyone for participating in the discussion. I hope we might have a few more minutes at the end of the sessions of the afternoon before the keynote of this evening. And I would like to move on to our next speaker, who is Stephen Walker from the University of Chicago. And his paper is entitled Nature, Power, and Critique in the Hoinanzi.
Hey everyone, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I am going to share my screen now. Okay, you can all see that? It's a good font size? Good.
Yes, excellent.
So let's talk about the Juananza. What is the Juananza? Well, one way you can approach it is that it is a text obsessed with with power, what I like to call sway or pull in a social context. The Juananza is obsessed with how power operates on every scale, because the writers talk as though is a fundamental structuring principle of every society, whether it's human, animal, mineral, etc. We could almost call this conception of or power a fractal conception, where the same basic dynamics are evident among celestial bodies, terrestrial states, everybody in the states, and everything inside those everybody's, their bodily and mental components. The Juananza authors could be identified as people who think that if you try to make an account of that doesn't explain all of those domains at the same time, or at least make a meaningful attempt to explain all of those domains at the same time, you're not doing very good work, because you're not talking about power or sway in the most general, broad possible setting. So what is this What is power, the way the Juananza guys would like us to understand it? Well, power is power over something, over another person, over another thing, what have you. If X has power over Y, effectively, if X is not merely trying to have power, but actually does have power, then Y complies. Y is compliant with X. You might say that's the definition of X being powerful. Hence, another way of looking at the Juananza's overall project is that it's an exploration of compliance at every scale, among planets, among lizards, among our bodily organs, and so on. Lack of trouble, things going smoothly. They ask questions like, well, what is it about the heavens? What is it about the sky that enables the celestial bodies to stay on their courses without fail? Is that the same thing as what enables governments to form alliances and accords with each other? Is it the same thing that allows merchants to get rich? Is it the same thing that allows you to continue being healthy and functional, and so on and so forth? These are all situations where there's some kind of dynamic shifting situation where some things are always more powerful than others. When I said that their conception of is fractal, essentially what I'm saying is they have a tendency to identify something as the Lord in every setting, sometimes human, typically not. So not only is something always more powerful than something else in any community, that powerful member's power must not be understood in terms of force. This is absolutely fundamental for understanding what they're doing. They recognize the necessity of violence and coercion, but they see that, I mean, maybe not as a regrettable necessity, but they see it as a secondary account of how it is that power operates. The primary or like essential account of power has to be something that doesn't involve coercion, but is something more like compulsion. Well, that has the wrong connotations in English, but a compelling force, one that effectively, rather than simply attempts to generate compliance. So, how do we go about identifying who is more powerful than somebody else, or what factor is more powerful than some other factor in a situation? I think these guys would say the most powerful member of a community is the most irresistible by definition. Irresistible, I think, in every sense. And if something is irresistible, that means that nobody is resisting it, or that resistance is in fact minimized. The writers warn against assuming that we can determine who or what is powerful using criteria like force or obviousness, fame, notoriety, title, and so on. They're suspicious of all of that. After all, forcefulness only makes sense against some counterposed force, which means it's not irresistible. And visibility involves having a fixed form and being brilliantly distinct from other people. And part of the inheritance the Juananza guys have from earlier quote unquote Taoist texts is suspicion of both fixed identity and obvious or brilliant contrast. They think that powerful people and powerful factors tend to be kind of unfixed. They tend to be kind of vague or shadowy. Because if they weren't, if they were not vague, but determinate, if they were precise, if they were forceful, what does that do but encourage resistance? And if we're thinking about this in terms of personal health, happiness, sensitivity, and so on, the more fixed, which is to say rigid you are, the more contrasted, that is to say different you are from other people and from your situations, the more dysfunctional you tend to be. These guys are extending claims that go back generations into texts like the evolving Zhuangzi tradition. I don't want to say the Zhuangzi as though it were fixed, but the Zhuangzi tradition certainly pre-existed the Juananza tradition. Forcefulness and visibility are pseudo-power. Pseudo-power is hurtful. Be suspicious. If you want real power over others, these guys would say, it is never going to be about you. It's not going to be an expression of ego if you go about acquiring and enhancing effective power, the effective ability to generate compliance. So what is it about if it's not about you? It's about, again, speaking socially, sort of zooming into the specifically human context, it's about what other people need and what other people like. It's about satisfying them. It's about enabling them to do as they like. This is a fundamental theme in the Juananza. I've seen it expressed more clearly there than in any other early Chinese political text. Giving people what they want at whatever scale always requires that you have a certain amount of power, and it creates a feedback loop where you get more power because people come to rely on you, whether they know it or not. The power of the giver escalates as those given to get pleased and flourish. Since forcefulness and visibility encourage resistance, we should not be envisioning the powerful as people who are famous or prominent in any way, even for giving. People famous for generosity? No, be suspicious of that too. They're probably working an angle and so on. It's not about people famous for giving unto others. It's rather about those people, and you can think about people in your own life, people you rely on thoughtlessly. It's about people who are your sine qua non. I'm sort of experimenting with this as of today as a translation of this Chinese phrase, which appears many, many times in the Juananza, that by which at least in the Anglophone scholarly world was made famous to me by Rudolf Wagner's work on Wang Bi, that by which, the sine qua non of things. You have some sine qua nons and they have power. And if you are somebody's sine qua non, you have power too. People who actually provide and enable you to flourish. So therefore, de has nothing directly to do. This is important. Juananza, getting beyond both moralism and legalism. And I'll keep legalistic lowercase l, because I agree with the thought that it's not a coherent social group or school of thought, but I think conceptually you can see it as a center of gravity. You could say it's the technocratic center of gravity. Guys who want politics to be about technique instead of personal qualities, we could call them legalists for now. Juananza finds that suspicious, just like it finds moralism suspicious. They think power doesn't have directly to do with either one of those things. Power is a structural relationship. It accrues to people who play the role of enabling others to do what they like to do or to do what they're inclined to do. Doesn't matter how smart you are, how wise you are, doesn't matter how good you are, benevolence, righteousness, etc. It doesn't matter what techniques you use. It matters a little, but it's largely irrelevant. It's not the core to understanding why somebody is powerful or why somebody is powerless, why somebody is weak or strong. The explanation doesn't lie in those things. Now, where does the explanation lie? Well, all over the place. I mean, countless factors play some kind of role in the process, but the writers consistently recommend that you think in terms of, and again, they don't actually say this in so many words in the Chinese. This is not a translation of anything they say. It's my philosophical reconstruction of what they're talking about. Disabling behavior and enabling behavior. They recommend understanding failure, social failure, the failure of your projects in terms of disabling other people. That's the explanation for why you failed. And if you succeeded, it's because you enabled other people to do something. So they would say, understand the agency of prominent people in terms of other people's satisfaction, which is the zhishuoyiran for maintaining or increasing a person's social status and position and effectiveness. Unless somebody is getting their safety, pleasure, etc. enhanced, nobody is leading anybody else. Even very forceful and destructive leaders cannot be understood primarily as forceful and destructive. I mean, this text is very blunt about the necessity of military operations. They certainly believe that destruction has a role in an organized society, but it can't be understood primarily as destructive. It has to be understood in terms of who the forceful party is enabling. And if a forceful party enables its followers by disabling its enemies, that's complicated and that may be true. But these guys would say the explanation for why that forceful party or power or person has power has to do with the enabling of their supporters, not the destruction of their enemies, at least not primarily. So 7, I would say, generalizes to quite a lot of early Chinese political texts, but it's particularly blunt in the Huainanzi. These guys do not recognize any meaningful moral critique of the powerful that is not, at the same time, an appeal to their self-interest. The writers seem to presuppose whatever degree of intransigence and contempt for independent moral standards we actually find among well-positioned people. They take it for granted. At one level, that's just a strategic choice, because this text is designed to appeal to people who are in powerful positions. And if your audience is used to being ready, willing, and able to coerce and exploit others, you don't have a lot to gain by telling them to surrender that. You have a lot more to gain by saying, yes, you can continue being at least ready and able to coerce and exploit others. So at one level, this is strategic, always appeal to the self-interest of the powerful, but there is more to it than that, at least I would say in this text. This conflation or fusion of moral critique and the appeal to self-interest has a philosophical point to deliver. If leaders, update complete. If leaders act in ways that undermine their ability to lead, their virtues are going to be thrown out right along with their vices when they inevitably lose position because they are no longer able to enable other people. Their readiness and capability to coerce and exploit is partly constitutive of the authority that they need if they're going to be enabling people on a broad social scale. A lesson for people who aren't yet in particularly powerful positions would go like this. Anybody seeking to rise socially would do well to analyze their chances in terms of satisfying other people. Your own benefit is tied by necessity to pleasing and enabling the people around you at some scale. And for the Huainanzi guys, any conception of moral conduct that isn't oriented that way, that does not reliably result, not without exception, but reliably, any conception of moral conduct that doesn't tend toward enhanced social standing is a pseudo-conception of morality. Just like models of power that are focused on coercion are pseudo-conceptions of power. So when it comes to critique, socio-political engagement, activism, in service of any goal whatsoever, these guys would say, keep consistent focus on the question of who your target is enabling to do what. The more dominant the target is, whether it's a person, a law, an institution, another government, the more dominant the target of critique, the more the critic needs to understand the benefits that are flowing from it, especially if those benefits go disproportionately to people the critic does not identify with. The understandable temptation to focus on the target's disabling influence directs our gaze away from the essence of the matter, these guys would say, which is that, well, if that target could be understood primarily in disabling terms, it would not have power because it wouldn't be compelling compliance from anybody. The fact that it compels compliance indicates that it is generous and enabling to somebody. And these guys would recommend, well, understand who those people are and maybe how your alternative could satisfy them better. Alternatives to existing leaders, existing governments, and existing institutions, I think these guys would say, alternatives tend to succeed in replacing them to the extent that they are more enabling than the older leaders, governments, or institutions were. There is nothing more to the process of regime change and political and social evolution, I think these guys would say. There's nothing more to that than the collective search for satisfaction. In more structural terms, the collective search for leaders by grace of whom you are able to attain satisfaction, person by person by person by person. What is guaranteed, the Juananza guys would say, is not that any given situation is particularly safe for anybody or is particularly pleasurable for anybody. What is guaranteed is that when it evolves, or like to the extent that it changes into a different kind of social situation, the core explanation, at least at the human level, is going to be that everybody in the society is constantly sort of weighing their chances, pledging potential loyalty to this versus that leader, this versus that law, and so on. De facto, ordinary people have enormous power, even if they don't have any, de jure power in a particular social order, because they make themselves available as followers to leaders who have divergent objectives. So, initiating and forcing, two things that quote unquote Taoists don't like. These guys don't like initiating and forcing. They say it in chapter 1 at great length. The thing about starting something and exerting force is that it is compatible with being socially effective sometimes in certain ways. And I would draw your attention once again to the fact that there is a chapter on that synthesizes the Bingjia traditions. There's a chapter on generalship. Initiating and forcing, I mean, if you want to talk at the level of infantrymen killing each other, it certainly has a place in this picture, but it doesn't explain very much. It doesn't explain why a military campaign is effective, or any other campaign, financial reform, what have you. If initiating and forcing did explain successful projects, then things like initiating and forcing, now let's zoom out again, they would also be explaining astronomy. They would also be explaining commerce. They would also be explaining digestion and metabolism. These guys think if you can't explain all of those in the same fundamental way, you're not really doing your job. And so, I mean, if you want to talk about digestion and astronomy and volcanoes or something, you could say, well, yes, force plays a role, just like force plays a role in social projects. But it's massively contextualized by counterforces to the point where it has almost no explanatory value on the large scale. Mutual patterning of various things sort of, rubbing up against each other and slipping and sliding past each other. That's more of a helpful picture to keep in mind when understanding things broadly. Such that, and this is in the same passage in book 1 where they criticize initiating, yin is a better explanation of how to excel. It's kind of like yin is what happens when a person's excellence is happening in a context as opposed to in a vacuum. Now, yin is an ambiguous expression. It can be interpreted in many ways. Idioms like catching on and fitting in and according with all seem to be on the table from my point of view. So finally, having a positive impact, these guys would say, is principally about placing yourself relative to other people, about putting yourself in a certain kind of position relative to them. It is not primarily about being a certain way yourself. It's not primarily about adopting a certain technique, like the technocrats would say. And it's certainly not a matter of what you believe or what you defend or what you hold fast to, like many moralists would say. Having a positive impact is about, thanks to so-and-so, I can now do this. You can analyze the duh that individuals have in those terms, like, thanks to so-and-so, I no longer need to do this really unpleasant thing that I used to need to do before that person helped me out or did it for me. That person has exerted a positive impact on me. And it aggregates and aggregates and aggregates when you're looking at broader social conditions. As far as the limits of somebody's potential positive impact, the limits of their pull, well, you can track those according to the limits on their readiness, willingness, or ability to enable other people. If there are things I'm not going to enable you to do, whether because I don't want them or because I can't do it, that is a limit on my ability to acquire and exercise power on this model. And so, I mean, I think these guys would agree, everybody has a ceiling. Everybody's upward ascent stops somewhere. And I think they would understand where somebody's upward ascent stops in terms of lines that person is not willing to cross. this is a fascinating text that obviously is going into dark waters at certain points like this, because the sage is beyond right and wrong in many ways, but that's for another day. Nobody can provide for everybody, and nothing lasts forever because everything is part of natural flux. And I think, just as sort of a send-off, these guys would say, if you always keep in mind that your projects are emerging from an ever-changing natural world, not only will that enable you to emphasize yin, catching on, fitting in, and according, it'll also enable you to explain your inevitable failures in a way that is somewhat relaxing and reassuring. Because it's not owing to your fault necessarily or anybody else's, it's just owing to the fact that everything is finite and part of vast natural processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and perfect timing, I have to say. Well, it was a fascinating talk. I think you've done an incredible job at just disentangling all this system, explaining it so clearly. I think it's so interesting to see how this figure of those who are in charge, in power, are actually not qualified by any specific, any particular, they're not particularly endowed, they're not morally endowed, they're not, they're basically just those who are most capable of enabling others. So they are a kind of means that basically provides others with opportunity. Mostly they have this regulative and structural function. They are basically just making sure that others can also get their way. So my question is, and then I will also leave some time for others to ask question, is how in this system are, for instance, public interest and private interest, how public interest, Gunli, and private interest interact with each other? And does the private interest of the leader somehow gets in the way? Are there competing situations? How do you deal when you want to get your way as a ruler? Does that also come in the picture? How do you somehow bring together in an efficient way all these private interests in a way that actually eventually enables the state to survive, to continue to be stable? Because I see that these could also become at a certain point some sort of divergent tendencies. So how is this comprising an efficient machine that works? Thank you.
That's a wonderful, thought-provoking question. Let me think about it for a moment. So a lot of what's going on in the Juananza, as I've mentioned, is synthesis of earlier positions. And I guess everybody already knows that. For people interested in legalism, chapter 9 is an absolute goldmine. It's a thorough rethinking of the entire legalist tradition. And so all of the answers to that question that people like Han Feize and Shun Buhai, innovated, those answers are incorporated into their answer. And so it's extremely important for them to cultivate dispassionate mental states, to show nothing and give nothing to your subordinates in order to be a sort of transhuman center without personality. All of that stuff they inherit. They also inherit a huge amount of stuff from the Zhuangzi tradition. And so I think their overall answer would say that if you want to embody a public interest, if you want to embody many people's interests instead of just a few people's interests, you need to be flexible and you need to empty yourself out. You need to do all of that cool Taoist stuff, like, being the sea into which rivers flow. And in particular, I'm fascinated by, from what I can tell, a completely overlooked little passage in chapter 25 of the Zhuangzi. In chapter 25 of the Zhuangzi, at the end, there's this very technical and underappreciated dialogue about Tao and language and stuff. And one of the claims made in passing in that dialogue is that just as a sea becomes great by accumulating little bits of water, and a mountain becomes great by accumulating little bits of rock, a man becomes great by accumulating private interests. And I can no longer think about that in isolation from what the Juananza is doing. I think the Juananza would recommend becoming a big person through allowing many, many people's private interests to enter into you and thereby sort of blend with each other into some kind of composite. I hope that's a helpful, at least a preliminary answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much. And we can take a couple of questions, maybe also from the audience, if someone wants to ask questions. Or we will have also, I think, some time after the sessions of the afternoon, if someone wants to think about it more. Oh, okay. Federico, please.
If nobody else is asking, I have a curiosity. What's the view that emerges, according to you, Stephen, from the finance in terms of hierarchy? I mean, you have used the term fractal, right? Fractal power. And it seems that these different centers of the can actually somehow coexist. I mean, they can influence a certain section of the world and be autonomous in that regard. So do you find a difference when comparing this view, cosmological and political and social view, to other views in the Chinese tradition that stress, on the contrary, the importance of hierarchy, of universalism, of the identifiable source of a supreme authority that is beyond all the other smaller authorities? Or what's the view that emerged from the finance? Thank you.
And thank you. That's also a very stimulating question. So when I talk casually about fractals, that's far from the whole story. I should probably evolve the way I talk about this, because fundamentally, the conception of power that I see in the Juananza is paradoxical. I mean, half the time they talk as though they expect some kind of absolutely vertical, or like roughly vertical pyramidal hierarchy of the kind we would associate with very strong central authority. The other half of the time, they talk about it like the pyramid is inverted. Like everybody is their own center of duh, and the only way to be at the top is to be the most inclusive. I think maybe the most helpful thing I can say right now, even if it's not that deep, is that it might help to keep that image in mind of the sea that receives all the rivers as their explanation of how centralized hierarchy actually does work. Because, I mean, famously, if we want to socially contextualize this, it's partly an argument for preserving the feudal lords against sort of incorporation into the bureaucracy. So it's in favor of legal institutional measures that distribute power, but it sees those as compatible with there still being an emperor. And I think the way they would rationalize that is in terms of the following. You can't have an emperor that forces his subordinates to do anything. Because if the emperor forces his subordinates, he undermines his own ability to enable others and becomes a tyrant instead. And so, yeah, there's more to say, but I'm afraid of going a little bit freeform if I try to keep talking. Was that at least a helpful beginning of an answer?
Yes, totally. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. And then we can move on to our third speaker for this session, Yixin, from the University of Princeton, and his paper is Disengagement from Power and Power of Disengagement, Rhetorics and Politics in Six Hypothetical Discourses, Shalom in the Han. Yixin, are you online?
Yes. Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction. So I'm now going to share the screen.
Yes, please. All good?
Good. Okay. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. The paper I'm presenting today is one of my recent studies, which explores some new ways of interpreting a series of Han literary works, with a specific focus on the political nature involved in their rhetorics. So to be specific, I'm going to talk about the group of texts that were later categorized in medieval China as 社论, hypothetical discourses. So central to these works is an imaginary debate between a host-like master and a guest-like interlocutor, in which the guest challenges the master's choice to disengage from official career, and the master makes his defense, maybe not surprisingly, winning the debate. Either presented as a fictional scenario or reliable record, a dialogue as a textual display is constructed by means of the deployment of voices, personas, and tones. This deployment implies a specific management of power and authority, and namely a political way of verbalization in itself. Such a political nature of rhetoric is made particularly clear in the 社论 text under review. Though there is no necessity to be stalked with 社论 as a name of literary subgenre that occurred only since medieval China, and I will argue in the paper that the way they are related to each other is not merely a byproduct of anthologization and categorization. But to start with, we may consider that some of these texts under review are indeed categorized as Shelun, first by the early medieval compilation Wenxue, where the compilers selected 3 representative texts, namely Dongfang Shuo's Da Ke Nan, Yang Xiong's Jie Chao, and Ban Gu's Da Bing Xi. All of them are first fully preserved in the Han Shu. During the Han Dynasty, literary works that shared the similar structure and topic with the 3 prominent Shelun include at least another 3 ones, respectively Cui Ying's Da Zhi, Zhang Heng's Ying Jian, and Cai Yong's Shi Hui. Most of them were reportedly composed with the author's awareness of being inspired or influenced by specific previous model within the same vein, and hence their intentions to create their own versions. So back to the question about Shelun as a category. We should know that, first of all, this term is found as a literary subgenre centuries after the Han, where there also exist a couple of alternative categories that are being used to group some of these works in association with other pieces. For the second point, we can consider especially the categories Nan, objection, and Dui Wen, response to questions. The first being noted as a category as early in the 3rd century CE, and the latter mentioned in both the Wenxue and the Wenxing Diaolong. So what such a condition of miscellaneous diffusion does is that it raises questions to what are now fully preserved and viewed together as a Shelun corpus, right? And namely, to what extent they constituted a meaningful, distinguishable series of literary artifacts. What made such a relatively small number of texts stand out and stay together? And what constituted a more specific totality of utterances and meanings that mattered to their composers and readers? This urges us to reconsider the following. The received Shelun not merely within the historiographic, biographical, and anthological context from which they were represented, but most importantly, to take a close reading and examination of the intertextual connections in terms of their contents, forms, voices, languages, and personas in which they existed. Within all the 6 texts, the dialogues begins with a guest-like speaker who demonstrates a conflict between the master's scholarly erudition and his lack of power, rank, and public recognition. The main body of the dialogue is then dominated by the voice of the master himself, who defends his choice to stay along with his business as a literary scholar, but disengage from an official career. The 6 texts collectively represent or present a topic as well as a problem about the relationship between scholarly individuals and institutional matrix in an imperial political culture. Such a condition, which I summarize as the master as a Han persona and his problem, is performed as both a historical matter and also an issue of timeless significance. So let me explain. To be specific, the master persona foregrounded within the text is a historical one because he is not merely a shi, a gentleman, or a worthy individual in general sense, nor is he a representative practitioner of eremitism in general. And his writing against the state is not equivalent to the expressions of the oppositional stance, to quote Mark Lewis, that is prevalent in early Chinese philosophical schools. Instead, I argue that this persona is a man of erudition, who is equipped with extensive literary learning and technologized by proficient literary skills, whose identity is largely recognized on an intellectual rather than a moral dimension. And this is an imaginary that gained prominence, especially during and after the late Western Han. The problem to which he confronts, therefore, is also an issue of timeless significance. He's in dealing with a seemingly everlasting matrix of imperial institutionalization in which any personal choice, including that to be made by a literary scholar, is now under the gaze of imperial power. And also the problem he confronts is an anxiety of self-manifestation, with one's literary business as a matter related to the matrix, a shared motive beyond the specificity of the life experience of the 6 Han authors themselves. Such an intratextual connectivity fundamentally releases us from the necessity either to defend or to eschew Shelun as a post-Han category per se, or to view them as an early medieval byproduct of anthologization and literary criticism. Let's move on to the close reading of the text themselves. In the first, presumably the first model to be followed, the 答克难 by Dongfang Shuo, the dialogue begins with a guest who challenges Master Dongfang that he, as an excellent literary scholar, earns only a position of a very low official rank. In Dongfang Shuo's response, the master explains the situation as an outcome of the change of time, attributing it to the transition of social political order from the Warring State period to the Han Dynasty. The Warring State is pictured as an age of conflicts and competitions, so that men with extraordinary talent can be easily discovered and get promoted. And the Han Dynasty correspondingly as a time of order and peace, in which that opportunity became less available. The solution he offers is therefore to normalize a scholar's disposition of power as a neutral outcome of political history. And what happened to all the 5 later Shilun after Dongfang Shuo is that they also employ a guest-like speaker to ask essentially the same question, while the master's replies from Yang Xiong onward became fundamentally different from that of Dongfang Shuo. Beyond an oversimplified point of view of seeing all the 6 Han Shilun on a linear axis from the initial master text to its many imitations or variations, I think the more meaningful approach is to investigate the entire body of literary proliferation beyond the first model. This approach leads us to my main observation that the 5 later Shilun constitute a web of even more tightly connected utterances, a condensed body, if you may, of collective expressions of a new scholarly stance. Such a new scholarly stance is a politically more radical one that claims for a self-oriented condition of intellectual life supplied by literary learning and writing, a way of living disengaged from power, but simultaneously gaining power exactly from that disengagement. First of the 5 later Shilun was Yang Xiong's 解嘲, which was a self-defense for his disinterest in a higher official rank, as well as a defense for his masterpiece, Taiquan. To better understand what he was doing, we can consider Yang Xiong's revisionary and competitive approaches in dealing with other sources, including the Yi, the 论语, and especially the literary pieces by Qu Yuan and Sima Xiangru. In doing all of this, he had a tendency to revise, to renovate, and to recompose everything that he took as a source of the anxiety of influences. In the present case, Yang Xiong took 答克难 only as another model to be critically revised via his own innovation. Instead of praising the contemporary Han Dynasty, what Yang Xiong did is to perform his master voice in a sarcastic tone, as he portrayed the time he lived in, namely the Western Han Dynasty, as an age where there was nothing serious going on, and a boring matrix in which people without extraordinary talents could acquire and keep their high positions. His oppositional stance is then expressed in a clustered, ironic presentation of those who gained their ranks and fames, depending on others' patrons and helps. By contrast, Yang Xiong found his self-contained value and pleasure with his own work, the Taiquan, a business that he takes as disentangled from external powers. At the end, the master closes the case and the whole text with a position-generating statement about his own choice. Indeed, I cannot juxtapose myself with this gentleman, thus I silently stay along with my Taiquan. The interesting thing is that in all the 4 Eastern Han Shilun after Yang Xiong, the master's speech included a similar position-generating statement in terms of their contents, forms, locations, and the rhetorical functions. It therefore opens a window towards an inquiry into the intratextuality among all the 5 Shilun after Dongfang Shuo, as not merely a condensed body of collective expressions, but also as an ever-renewing framework open to its own iterations, appropriations, and variations. All of them consist of a I would and I would, all of them consist of a I would not, but I would structure. Normally as a 2-line couplet that declares first, the master's disengagement from other access to power, rank, and fame. And second, his self-oriented interest in literary learning and writing. Second, all of them come right after a clustered presentation of around a dozen of other exemplary figures who are publicly recognized by many reasons, but mostly because of their excellence in arts, skills, and techniques in a general utilitarian sense. And here, what stands out from this business is literary learning, which is a choice that the master himself will take as his own business. And even more importantly, all these position-generating statements are located at, or they're close enough to, the end of the master's speech. And normally, it is also the end of the entire text as well, with a gesture to give the text a formal closure with the master's voice in a winning song. The position-generating codas, along with the clustered presentation of various figures to which they were attached, and also the master's winning voices in which the debate is closed, altogether constituted an identifiable body of utterances that stand out as the core text, I will call it, across all the 5 Shulen. Around this core text, numerous expressions were progressively articulated with limited variability. And second, the Jiechao in this regard gains its own significance not as the first imitation of the Dakenan by Dongfang Shuo, but as the actual foundation on which a critical and revisionary literary tradition was gradually formulated and constructed, as well as the core text in another sense. They're surrounded by its own echoes and variations. So here I will be scanning over a selective range of passages that are excerpted from the 4 Eastern Han Shilun to make my point very clear, in which we will witness some recurring patterns and themes associated with what we have just identified as the core passage among all. And see first example in Bangu's Dabingxi. He gave a positive and self-related way of clustered presentation of another kind of exemplars, the scholarly idols of literary learning and practicing. And we can see also a very explicit declaration of one's oppositional intellectual stance against official power and rank in the Shilun of Cui Ying and also Zhang Heng. And finally, we can see Cai Yong's Dazhi, in which he presents a spectacular display of the master's journey among an imagined archive of knowledge and text, where and this was composed right after he just escaped from an offer that he received from the imperial court that is interested in his talent as a musician. So the point is that he is unwilling to take an offer from the court just because of his crafts and skills in a general sense. Instead, he chose to engage in his business as a disengaged scholar. Within this Shilun, the master voice played as both the host of the imaginary debate and the avatars of the real host who control the text. The master's victory is settled in advance as the foundation instead of the outcome of the dialogue. Such a winning voice not merely relies on the effects of its ethical, moral, or philosophical powers, but more essentially relies on its rhetorical power of language and knowledge, which overwhelms the text by means of the condensed output of utterances, vocabularies, and clustered examples. These features, to be specific, is not very obvious in the first Shilun by Dongfang Shuo, but they are very obviously identifiable in the 5 later ones. The text, therefore, constituted exactly the textual display of the value that it speaks of, namely a self-oriented interest in wide-ranging literary learning and writing, a business that is performed as superior to other skills, crafts, or techniques in a general sense. On the other hand, it performs a gesture of disengagement from the matrix of imperial institutionalization, as well as a resistant stance against the alienation of scholarly labor and individuality that is imposed by that matrix. Either of the 2 sides provide an alternative ground for the other, suggesting a desirable mode of intellectual life that is disengaged from institutional power, but simultaneously becoming an alternative authority that gains power from that disengagement. Towards a larger picture, I argue that such a power-generating performance of the values of erudition, individuality, and disengagement can be viewed as a textual realization of a wider range of literary and social phenomena from the late Western Han through to the Eastern Han and beyond. Equally important is how the scholarly values proposed in the 5 Shilun were inscribed into a shareable identity, either through the making of ideal models who embodied those values, or by producing specific otherness as the upside, the different, or the inferior. Such an image making and power generating process was actualized in these Sherlun masters' self-identifications, as well as their clustered presentation of others in either positive or negative way. The condensed body of collective expressions in this Sherlun, therefore, constitute the very nature of their shared rhetorics and politics, because the discourse is hypothetically staged up only for the sake of its closure in a winning voice. Thank you for your time. I hope I'm within the time, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much. You're perfect, and we have some time for my questions, but I will make sure also, I already have questions for you waiting, so I would like you to have as much feedback as possible. So I really enjoyed reading your paper. I enjoyed your presentation. I must say I was not familiar with this, let's say, genre, or anyway, this cluster of texts, if we want to say. I really like the fact that as much as you're clearly very well aware of how it has been handled, of its contextualization in the dynastic histories, that you actually zoom out from that perspective and you try to actually build some narrative of this text, that you look at these intertextual, intratextual references, and especially you analyze the structure and see what is this underlying thread by which we can possibly say that they are some sort of pre-genre. So that was really fascinating. I really like that you actually focus on this part of the text. I would have liked to see also, for instance, how the rest of the text is structured, but I understand that this might be ongoing work also that you might want then to include in your dissertation. So I can understand if you are not presenting all of this, but I would definitely be interested in seeing how the whole structure unravels, of course. So by what I could see from the paper, I have a very quick question, and then I will leave the floor also so that also others can ask a question. So Confucius, of course, pops up here and there. And so I wanted to ask you, what kind of role does the trope of Confucius plays in this text? Because he is some kind of also relatively unsuccessful from the political point of view figure, but a very much cherished figure. So he somehow, I think, could potentially represent a very well kind of ideal that could echo or somehow appeal to this kind of intellectual context. And then something that, as I said, I haven't seen this whole structure, so it might have nothing to do, but I noticed this 4-character structure that, and I'm just wondering if it's associated with the figure of Confucius, if it's some sort of echo of the Analects, if that kind of play also in the structure in correspondence of the figure of Confucius, or if they're not related, because without the whole structure, I can't say, but it made me think that the two things might come together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's not a small question, but a big one. So let's start with Confucius. I think the scholars has extensively argued that how the image of Confucius was constructed and reshaped during and after the Han Dynasty. And as an authority, in terms of both his sagehood and his moral excellence, and also his achievement and accomplishment in literary learning, his contribution to the literary practicing. From all these aspects, that Confucius can be constructed as a model from which the people for different purposes can take what they want to say and put it into the mouth, or relying on the saying of Confucius. So it is in this sense that the 论语 as a corpus really rise up to a very prominent status in the Han Dynasty, because people can always have what they want to say by revising or quoting the 论语 or the saying attributed to Confucius. So speaking of this scholarly group that I'm talking about, the rise of their scholarly agendas against the state has much to do with Confucius per se. But I don't have time to really elaborate that structure, but just to give some examples, that Confucius, we know that in the 论语, Confucius talk about some scholarly models about broad learning, 博学, and he also talk about an ideal model of learning that he attributed to antiquity, that namely the 古之学者. They engage in learning not for the purpose of others, but for the purpose of themselves. So such a self-oriented focus of literary learning is to a very large extent reinvented by late Eastern Han and Eastern Han thinkers. And I'm talking about Liu Xiang, and we're talking about Yang Xiong and Ban Gu and Wang Chong, these kind of people. They extensively quote and renovate the saying of Confucius and to construct a new scholarly model that they situated in their own context, the Han time. So this is a very overwhelming phenomenon, I think, across the Han intellectual world by creating a new discourse, but through a revisionary approach of meaning production that is heavily indebted to Confucius, or not Confucius as the person, but Confucius as a corpus, as a repertoire. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's really a great paper. I hope we will have time to discuss more. And I have a question here in the chat that I'm going to read now because Maddalena Poli says there's a lot of noise, so I'm going to read the question for her. Thanks for this. Could you clarify the, sorry, I'm trying to read, but it's mixing up. You refer to the author problem and later in the talk of shareable identity based on the Shilun. What sources? Okay, I can't see the second part of the question, sorry. Okay.
Please, if you want, I can read it.
Yeah, please.
It says, you refer to the other problem and later in the talk of shareable identity based on the Shilun. What sources outside the Shilun would you use to support the claims? I understood the first part to be primarily based on theoretical studies about authorship. Is that correct?
Okay, thank you. I understand the question, I think. So all the 6 Han Shilun that we are talking about, if we go back to their contextual information, that they are all presented within what we know as the mainstream historiography compilations. The first 3 Shilun, we see them in the Han Shu, and number 4 and 5, 6, we see them in the Hou Han Shu. So they are provided in a historical and also biographical context of reading, and that lends some support to the last English scholarship monograph on this subgenre is by Dominic de Klerk, and he basically is doing a very historical and biographical reading and to relate these works with their authors' life experience and the specificity of the political environment that they're surrounded with. But I'm taking another approach, saying that I don't take this as a very direct and straightforward and specific reflection of their own living experience. But I think they are working on a theoretical level and working on a level that speak of some values that is suitable and valuable, cherishable to a shareable identity that they, in which they identify with themselves as. So in addition to this biological contextual context of this text, that we also in a later age we find this text anthologized into encyclopedias and anthologies, but that's a later story. But all this accumulation of literary traditions kind of safeguard our belief of this authenticity and the authorship of this text. But I want to argue that this is not the main point, because I do not very much rely on the specific authorship one-on-one, then mapping the text to the author, because what we can identify is actually a collective body of expressions that is not very particularly belonging to a specific person, but it talk about a persona, in my phrase, that is shared by a larger community.
Thank you so much for your answer. We might take one last quick question if there's some more. Okay. All right. We have another question in the chat. I'm also in a loud place, sorry. I'm glad my chat is working again. My question is this: what is the function of the warring state nostalgia in the text? E.g., it was better for scholars in a world that was not united and there were many patrons. Where else do we see this? From Trenton Wilson. Thank you, Trenton.
Yeah, thank you. I think that question makes a lot of sense. And also when I hear Professor Yuri presentation, and I feel that this my presentation is very much related to that, because Professor Yuri is talking about the warring state in age of chaos, disorder, and competition. And people can, the Shi, intellectuals, they can seek for patronage from different monarchs and laws. But I'm talking about a very different political culture that is an imperial institutional matrix, in which that the so-called 大一统, or the so-called fetishization about oneness has already been realized. And then what do we do? That's the question. That's a new question and new problem to be confronted by intellectuals and literary scholars. Because we are now talking about an environment that, okay, the country, the kingdom has already been unified and everything is under the gaze of power. And people seems to have a systematic approach to get promoted, to get involved in the political system. But there are some free-minded thinkers who is cynical or free-minded and they're critical. They don't want to engage that much because it's very uncool. And they need to figure out a way of looking for a new alternative way of authority that is detached from that matrix. And so this, I think this is the major problem that they are confronted with. And also that's why I figure out this persona as a historical one. And back to the question you raised, that the nostalgia for warring state, yes, that is a topic not shared by all, but shared by some of these children texts. And they also actually have some disagreement on this point. Like Ban Gu says, Dongfang Shu and Yang Xiong, in their Shelun, they're performing a nostalgia to warring state. I disagree. I think the Han Dynasty is the best. But even in that case, I have my own choice that I live in a good time, but I choose to focus on something that I think is valuable and interesting, literary learning. I don't want to juxtapose myself with other people who get promoted in their own ways. So I think the warring state nostalgia is a theme and a topic performed by some of these children authors, but also we have some disagreement on that point as performed but from a different political point of view, such as by Ban Gu. But that's a very interesting point. And I also noticed that some Chinese scholars, they argue from this point of view by establishing a warring state versus imperial Han Dynasty dichotomy. That's obviously a very important historical background that all these authors are aware of, but they are figuring out different solutions to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all the speakers of this session and to all those who asked questions. And I think we can now move on to our next panel for this afternoon, which is entitled Ming Political Philosophy and Practice. The panel has two papers by Sebestyen Hompot and John Lombardini, and it will be, we will have the pleasure to have Dr. Phillip Grimberg as our discussant. So I will introduce Dr. Grimberg, and then we can immediately start. So Dr. Grimberg earned his PhD from Cologne University with a PhD thesis on Leger's A Book to Burn, and is now also a private docent, as he has earned his habilitation last year, and he has had appointments at the University of Cologne, of Bonn, of Göttingen, and he is now has a research project at the IKGF at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. Philip, are you checking? Are you with us? I hope so, but we can also start now with our first paper for today, for this session, by Sebestyen Hompot. Sebestyen, are you?
Hi, I'm here.
Excellent. Okay, perfect. So Sebestyen Hompot from the University of Vienna and the Austrian Academy of Sciences will give a paper entitled The Interpretations and Evaluation of Ming-Qing China's Tributary System of Foreign Relations in Recent Historiography. Thank you so much, Sebestyen. The floor is yours.
So can you see it, my screen?
Yes, it's coming slowly, but it's here now. All good.
So good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here online today and present a paper related to my current PhD dissertation project. I'm writing my PhD dissertation at the University of Vienna and the Austrian Academy of Sciences on recent mainland Chinese historiography on the so-called tributary system of foreign relations of Ming-Qing China. The theoretical and methodological approach I am using is critical discourse analysis. Critical discourse analysis focuses on the interconnections between human communication, in this case historiography, and power relations, as well as ideologies. It has, in the context of historiography, there is a special focus on intertextuality as well, how primary sources are re or decontextualized, also in connection often with ideology, with power relations. Just a quick note on the term tributary system as well. Tributary system as a term is criticized by a number of people, especially historians. I would like to make clear that hereby I do not wish to argue that tributary system in functional terms was one unified system in Ming and Qing China. There were tributary exchanges, but in fact there was a large diversity based on region, based on smaller historical periods. What I would like to argue is that tributary system is a useful term when it comes to discourse analysis. First of all, because tribute or gung was clearly part of the worldview of the Ming-Qing political elite. So they made meaning of the word based on how other rulers introduced tribute. And perhaps most importantly, it is very important in today's reassessments of China's traditions of foreign relations in present day political science and historical research. So I wish to reflect on tributary system as a discourse, as a so-called discourse field in my research. I would like to provide a quick overview of the history of the tributary system concept. Tribute system was coined by the US-American sinologist and historian John K. Fairbank. Fairbank described the tributary system as a Confucian-based sinocentric world order, which was an extension of China's domestic social order into the realm of foreign relations. As Fairbank describes, tributary exchanges consisted of ritualized presentation of gung or tribute by foreign rulers in exchange for ci or gifts, and the conferment of mostly symbolic titles from the side of the Chinese emperor. As Fairbank introduces it, the idea of the tributary relations reflected generally the Confucian ideas of hierarchical and harmonious relations between the ruler and the subject showing filial piety towards the ruler, while the ruler ruling through one, civility and the virtue. So Fairbank also was aware of the fact that, in fact, tributary relations often had much more pragmatic reasons to participate. They were often motivated, the foreign rulers were often economically motivated to participate in them. And therefore, Fairbank also called tributary exchanges a cloak for trade. Tributary exchanges reached an especially high or broad geographical extent during the Zhenghe maritime missions. During the Zhenghe missions, the tributary exchanges reached as far as East Africa and the Middle East, as shown on this map. Later, the tributary system concept was reformulated as tribute trade system by the Japanese economic historian Hamashita Takeshi. He wished to emphasize the importance of the legally sanctioned so-called tribute trade, which was conducted as part of these missions. So these were profit-oriented exchanges beyond the ceremonial exchange of gifts and tribute, which were often much larger in value than the tribute and gifts themselves. So in China, the term has started to enter the academic discourse with a larger attention in the 2000s, and the Chinese translations of the tributary system like Chaogung Tixi and Chaogung Zhidu started to appear more and more frequently. Here is a graph generated from the Chinese National Knowledge Infrastructure Database, which shows that there was an especially a large number of articles discussing Chaogung Tixi and Chaogung Zhidu in the 2010s. This was likely also related to the initiation of the Belt and Road Initiative and the general growing interest towards the Chinese traditions of foreign relations. So there has been an increasing number of political scientists as well who started to discuss the tributary system. There has been a discussion going on to which extent the tributary system among the East Asian states in the Ming and Qing period contributed to regional stability, to the relatively low number of armed conflicts among the East Asian states. So there is the US-American author David Kang, who published his book in which he argues that the tributary system served stability in Ming and Qing era East Asia. And of course, this was also criticized by a number of authors. There are critiques, both historians and political scientists, of the mainstream tributary system discourse. So they argue that the tributary exchanges, as I mentioned already, they did not constitute a system, or even if they constituted a system, they were only like systematically operating in the case of a few countries, mostly Korea, which sent the most tributary missions to China in this period, and they were not the main avenue of China's relations with the outside world. And some other critics like Peter Perdue also argue that the whole tributary system discourse is a new soft power strategy of the Chinese state to construct sort of the peaceful traditions, to construct this peaceful traditions narrative. So turning to my discourse analysis of the recent historiography since the 2000s on the tributary system, especially in the 2000s, we can see that most authors who write about the tributary system, they discuss it in a way of comparing it with the colonial order or the so-called Westphalian order originating from the West. So there are lots of publications from especially the 2000s, which do not really go beyond the binary comparisons of the tributary system versus the colonial order of the West. So hereby, these binary comparisons are based on constructing the Chinese self versus the Western other, and describing China as being essentially different from the West, and arguing through the comparison of the tributary versus the colonial order for the essential importance of these differences. So China is basically described as being governed by the pre-modern Confucian and Sinocentric worldview, which was hierarchical. It was based on this hierarchical worldview, and based on the importance of ceremonies and rites in Confucianism. China's relations with the so-called tributary states were based rather on ceremonial ties instead of real domination or real economic profit making from these relations. And the tributary system is usually described as being economically detrimental to China, using the Ho Wang Bo Lai phrase, meaning that China gave much and received little in return. And in contrast, the Western colonial order is described as being based on direct political control, on economic exploitation of the colonized territories, and all this despite of the emerging notions of nominal equality. And so altogether, these authors often want to answer the question why China fell behind the West. So this is the overarching question usually, and it's often explained in throughout the tributary order, as China was lacking efficiency in its foreign relations. And altogether, polarization into binary comparisons and self-victimization are important parts of this literature. So, however, there are also more creative and innovative publications, especially from the more recent years, which try to reinterpret the tributary system more also together, or they want to reinterpret also via creating new theories of international relations or of global history. And they want to, these authors want to sort of often create some theories which are based on Chinese experience or Chinese historical experience or Chinese specificities. There is, for example, the argument by Shang Hui Peng referring to the Chasu theory of Fei Xiaotong, the anthropological theory of Fei Xiaotong, that it was sort of the tributary system was based on these social relations. And there is the symbiosis or the Gongsheng approach, which argues that the tributary system was principally based on Gongsheng. So hierarchy was a secondary thing vis-a-vis achieving symbiosis of states with various capacities. And in a similar vein, there is the argument of the international relations scholar Qin Yating, who is interested in setting up a Chinese school of international relations theory. Qin Yating argues that the Western theories cannot sufficiently explain China's present and future role, like future ideal role in the global order. The Western theories, although based on nominal equality, are also based on the historical experience of continuous rivalry among the various nation states of Europe with similar capabilities, and China should rely on its own theories to achieve stability as a re-emerging major state in East Asia, and to an increasingly on the global stage. So I would like to reach to my conclusion. I believe the tributary system discourse gains special relevance due to the changing power relations of today, due to China's reemergence as a global power center. So this discourse in most cases is not only about the past, but about the present and the future. And there is the keen interest of many scholars to sort of return to pre-modern traditions and sort of build up China's identity in the present time based on both Western theoretical influences and the pre-modern influences from China's past. So this is also a trend of the decolonization or de-Eurocentralization of global history, and in fact of international relations theory as well. And there are some questions regarding the future of this discourse, which I plan to analyze further in the future. So the question remains how much we reach a decentralized or multipolar view of history, or how much a new centrism, a Sinocentric view of global history emerges. There is also the question how much this discourse will serve indeed as a theoretical basis for China's insistence of stability and peaceful interstate relations, or how much it will become a legitimizing discourse of expansionism. And also I would add that the decolonization also inside of China is an increasing really relevant question, like how tribute relations actually worked with Inner Asia, with these regions, because this is mostly simply missing from the Chinese discourse. So with these thoughts, I would like to conclude my presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebestyen. And now we can have Philip's comments on your paper and more questions also from the audience. Philip, you would like to take over?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Sebestyen, for your paper, which I really enjoyed. I think it's a very, if I'm not mistaken, it is, sorry, it is part of your PhD project in Vienna, or it is your PhD project in Vienna. I think it's a very interesting, project. It's a very interesting take, this sort of meta historiographic approach, using discourse analysis and looking into how present day current Chinese historiography deals with this topic, with the concept of the tributary system. You stressed in your paper, and I think rightfully so, that it is a rather recent invention. At least the concept is a rather recent invention by Fairbank, who coined, as you said, the term in order to sort of grapple with the existing fact of tributary exchanges and tributary relations of China between, the periphery, if you want to call it like that. And one, I think, vital point, there are a couple of vital points, but one vital point that I want to point out now is the criticism that you mentioned of the term, of the concept, saying it is not so to speak, an indigenous historical term, but it is a modern day invention that is sort of, you know, propped onto the discussion about the historical fact. I think this is something that is rather important when thinking about the phenomenon of tributary relations between the Chinese court and its neighbors. One thing I think that is also interesting that came across from your presentation is that these relationships between China and other countries, other nations, as you said, were detrimental to Chinese economy, or were at least not beneficent to the Chinese economy, as one might think at first glance. And I think this is also an interesting point. I have just one thing came to mind when looking into the Ming. The history of the Ming records in very close detail the foreign relations of the Ming court with various other nations and powers. And in the chapters on the Xiyu and Waiguo relations between Ming China and these, especially the Western territories, the Xiyu chapters, they very much do demonstrate that what you just said, in the relationship between China and the sultans of Turfan, for example, you can very aptly see how unbalanced these relations were or grew over time, because in the beginning, when these relations, this exchange and tributary relations began in the early 15th century, you see the Turfan expeditions coming to the court, coming to Beijing, bringing tribute, receiving gifts, and going back to Turfan. And what happened is that the Turfan sultans figured out that with these very valuable gifts from China, they can make a lot of money when they sell them back in Turfan or on the way back from Beijing to the West. So that we find passages in the Ming recording court officials cautioning the emperor of not receiving so many expeditions, so many embassies from Turfan, because it's costing the court so much money that eventually the revenue gets sort of, you know, drained by all the silver, all the money that is being taken out from the court onto these missions. And so the tributary exchanges and this model of a center peripheral relationship between China and everybody else sort of probably needs a new way of looking at it. And I think you're doing that in your project, and I think you're on a good way, and you're doing it in a I think very interesting and methodologically sound way. Just one or two words to your concluding remarks. I think it's interesting the points that you mentioned, that the scholarly discussions about the terms used. You mentioned for example, as one of the terms that are used in current Chinese scholarly discussions, that they also play a part in formulating, if you like, a new political agenda that is based on historiography in contemporary China. And one thing I think, of course, that clearly plays a part in there, or that plays into this whole discourse, of course, is nationalism. We see that when we look at current discussions, for example, in Chinese archaeology, that sort of tick the same boxes, where we see a very clear instrumentalization of archaeology within, you know, the context of political debates. So yes, that would be my take on your paper, and I thank you very much, and I open the floor for further questions to Sebestyen Hompot.
Okay, so
yes.
Yuri, and I think first Yuri and then Federico, they were almost simultaneous. So Yuri, please go ahead. You're muted. Yes.
Now, okay. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting paper. I just want to warn against the usage of CNKI as an indicator of the increase of discussion about any topic, because remember, we have much more publications in the last 20 years. We have much more PhD programs throughout China. So much more students are publishing on anything, and everybody wants to find some kind of a niche. So I think that if you want to check whether or not the topic of the tribute relations became more prominent, you need to check the percentage of conferences in China, and you can do it from the history Nianjian, the yearbook, to check how the percentage of relevant conferences, for instance, increased or decreased over the time, because then we can really think how much more people are interested in this topic. Otherwise, when you just play with numbers, I'm afraid that it is not very accurate.
Sebestyen, you would like to say something, or shall we take more?
Should I answer to each comment? Okay,
yeah,
I can first answer to Mr. Grimberg's comment. Thank you very much for the comments. To put it more accurately, my PhD project is actually based on the Zhenghe mission's historiography's discourse analysis. I did not say it entirely correctly in the beginning, because it was my master's thesis, which was based on the Ming tributary system, but I decided to focus only on the Zhenghe missions later, because that's it's easier. So it's a shorter period, and it's a very widely discussed set of events. So the other comments that, in fact, so I have read parts of the Ming on the number of tributary envoys from the Western region, and it's in fact interesting that how it's like described, like how many envoys were sent from Turfan, especially. Yes, and I have also read a few publications which dealt with the history of tribute relations in the Western regions, and yes, there were similar reports that a lot of like it was detrimental, because there were much more gifts provided than tributes taken. However, there are also more and more authors who question this the Ho-Wang Bolai narrative as being like a universal phenomenon of the whole Ming and Qing period. So in this regard, also there is a critique of this earlier scholarship that to generalize like the whole tributary system was Ho-Wang Bolai. So and regarding the conclusion, yes, I totally agree that nationalism is a very important factor. I did not go into this direction in this presentation, but I am using frameworks of Chinese nationalisms as part of my PhD project. There is, for example, the framework of Xu Qilin, who is a prominent Chinese intellectual today, who sort of constructs a way of categorizing Chinese nationalisms based on rediscovering what he calls the Tianxia ideal. So he belongs to this new like Tianxia philosophers, but it's quite an analytically strong approach, in my opinion, to classify like different like soft nationalism or cultural nationalism versus hard nationalism or ethnic nationalism. So I definitely use these nationalism frameworks in my research. And thank you for the comment of Mr. Yuri Pines as well. In fact, in general, in CNKI, we can see more and more publications as the time progresses, and I thank you for your suggestion of checking the history yearbook percentages. I think it's still interesting that like in the CNKI graph, there was a drop in the numbers in the last years. However, I also have the suspicion that it's maybe simply because these were not yet put on the CNKI, which were published in these last years. So maybe that's also a possibility. I think there is a chance that there was more discussion of this, especially the junk emissions. They were clearly much more discussed in like around 2005. So there were way more publications on junk than in the last years. And there was also an increase in 2013 in the inauguration of the Belt and Road Initiative. So thank you for the comments so far.
Thank you so much, Sebestyen. And we have Federico.
But Lisa, if you agree, I will happily give my time to Professor Harriet Zurndorfer, who has raised her hand.
Professor Zurndorfer, you can go ahead and mute yourself. And
okay,
please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Sebestyen, thank you very much for your paper. I'm very glad to see so many people interested in Chinese maritime history. It's a subject that has really not had its due audience. One small comment about how you started your paper with regard to Fairbank. Many people who work on maritime history, including Fairbank's most famous student in that subject, John Wills Jr., the late John Wills, in his lifetime criticized Fairbank for using the tribute system for that part of China. The tribute system is not one size fits all. But what I was missing in your presentation, and I think is extremely important, is the economic component, because these tribute missions were extraordinarily profitable for the people who came to pay tribute. Not only were the value of the gifts given by the Chinese to the tribute mission very expensive and desirable, merchants accompanied these tribute missions, and they became more and more part of the commerce between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. And the court itself also benefited from the smuggling that went on besides the tribute missions. So if you're going to talk about Chenghe and then compare it to nationalistic perspectives from nowadays, I do consider that you enter the economic component in your analysis, because there's a lot of motivation there to make money on both sides. That's my comment.
Thank you so much. Sebestyen, you would like to say something so that we can then wrap up?
Yes, thank you for the comment. And I totally agree that the economic component is very important. I tried to hint at this a little bit in this tribute trade concept, which was first developed by Hamashita Takeshi. And indeed, there were merchants who accompanied the Zhenghe missions, and in general, this whole China's interaction with the outside world, I mean, the maritime interactions were much more complex, involving tribute, involving trade, smuggling. So this is definitely an important point to not to ignore the economic component, and especially in the maritime context. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then we can move on to our next and last speaker for this session, John Lombardini from the College of William and Mary, who's going to talk about ethics and politics in leaders feng shui. Hi, John.
Thank you, Lisa.
Hi, we can see.
Yeah. Okay,
Yes.
great. Yeah, I'm
All good.
just getting my slide. Can everyone see my
Yes.
presentation? Okay,
Yes.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Let me just get that over there so then I can see it too. Great. So I'm, as Lisa said, I'm John Lombardini. I teach at William and Mary down in Virginia in the United States. I'm a political theorist by training, and my subject of most of my research has been on the theme of ethics and politics, but mostly within classical Greek and Roman political thought. Chinese political thought is a relatively recent interest of mine that I've been working on over the past couple of years. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present at this conference and really looking forward to any feedback that you might have. So as the title of my paper indicates, right, it examines the relationship between ethics and politics in Li Zhi's Fen Shu, right, focusing in particular on his essay on weapons and food and his correspondence with Geng Dingsheng, right? Just to talk a little bit about the kind of framework that I have in the back of my mind when kind of conducting this analysis. First is a quote from Young Min Kim's History of Chinese Political Thought in his chapter on kind of Sung and Ming Dao learning, his idea of the metaphysical republic. He asks, how did the Chinese elite from the Southern Song onward maintain the apparent contradiction between their egalitarian metaphysical outlook and inegalitarian socio-political structure? The second framework that kind of motivates the way I'm looking at this question is one that comes out of some recent literature on Confucian democracy. So here we have Stephen Engel's quote from his book Sagehood, that if we lose the connection between ethics and politics, we lose the central tenet of Confucianism, right? And so that kind of argument or Engel's comment about the connection between ethics and politics and Confucianism comes out of this desire to imagine a possible Confucian form of democracy that's compatible with the modern fact of pluralism, right? And I think as I see it, these arguments have a couple of important premises in common, even though the arguments themselves might be distinct. First, as Engel's quote suggests, right, that ethics, they view Confucianism as a political philosophy, as an ethical philosophy in which ethics and politics are interdependent, right? Second, they argue that Confucian ethical thought, as it's traditionally understood, is both monist and perfectionist, right? So in other words, it maintains that there is a single ethical framework that is valid and seeks to create a social and political order that reflects that ethical framework. And then third, given its monism and perfectionism, the relationship between ethics and politics must be reconceived to render Confucianism compatible with democratic institutions. Thus, its perfectionism must be moderated, as Joseph Chan has argued, where public debate should be ordered within the framework of a Confucian form of public reason, as Sung-Min Kim has argued, or the relationship between ethics and politics must be reimagined as more dialectical than direct, as Engel himself argues, kind of drawing on Mo Zongsan. So in this paper, right, I suggest that the writings of Li Zhi also give us some kind of hook on problematizing this relationship between ethics and politics within Confucianism as it is often understood, right? So to be clear, Li's goal is not to advocate for democratic institutions or even a more egalitarian political order. Rather, he is critical of the idea that Confucian public officials ought to actively encourage ethical cultivation among the common people. Li challenges the idea that good government requires the moral education of the populace, arguing that individual self-interest provides a firmer foundation for social and political order. Moreover, Li argues that this top-down hierarchical approach to moral education hinders rather than promotes ethical cultivation. In short, Li's thought offers a critique of the relationship between ethics and politics within Confucianism as it is traditionally conceived. Right. So from there, we'll take brief looks at the two essays that I focused on, right? So Li begins his essay on weapons and food with an anthropological account of the origins of human beings, where he says when the human race first arose, they lived like wild beasts, they lived in caves, gathered food from the wild, right? But they didn't have any of the advantages that the animals had, like fur or claws or sharp teeth. They needed protection, so they made weapons using materials from the natural world. They needed food, so they developed the well-field system, right? And Li concludes that concludes the opening part of the essay, arguing that weapons and food are what allow human beings to escape the precariousness of their early existence and live in peace and quiet, right? So from here, Li turns to Analects 12:7, right? And proceeds to kind of offer what he takes to be a kind of novel rereading of this passage within the Confucian tradition. So this passage, which I think we saw in our first session this morning as well, right, is the one where Zigong asked Confucius about government. And Confucius argues that you need to provide sufficient weapons, sufficient food, and the trust of the people. Zigong proceeds to ask, well, if you can only have two, which do you get rid of first? If you can only have one, which do you get rid of first? And Confucius concludes, or seems to conclude, that trust, or Shin, is the most important, right? So Li Zhi argues, right, that Confucians have actually misunderstood and actually reversed the meaning of this passage in saying that trust is more important than weapons and food, right? So for Li, this was not Confucius's point at all. He was not arguing that weapons and food ought to be discarded, right? Nor that trust is more important than weapons and food. He was simply responding to the question that was asked, right, by Zigong. So his response is compensatory here rather than establishing a kind of universal principle about governance, right? Li also further contends that Confucius recognized that the people trust the ruler precisely because he provides them with sufficient weapons and food, right? So as long as he's done so in the past, and then in the present, the people recognize that the reason why he's taking some of them away is because he's forced to, right? Then they will continue to remain loyal to him in the future, right? So Li's insistence that Confucians have misunderstood Analects 12:7 foregrounds the broader claim that he develops as the essay continues. And that is that Confucians mistakenly believe that social and political order depends upon those in power providing instruction, whether it be moral or otherwise, to their subjects. Rather, Li appeals to the Yellow Emperor as a model, claiming that since he believed that the people were extremely dull-witted, he can entice them with the promise of profit. Introducing the well-field system encouraged them to perform the necessary hunting rituals to ensure the health of their crops, and hunting provided training in military affairs. As such, there was no need to enforce military training, and yet Li observes Confucians, quote, erroneously believed that the sages took advantage of the gaps in the agricultural calendar to instruct the people in military affairs. Now, this was equally true in Li's assessment in the case of moral instruction. The people did not need their ruler to instruct them regarding the 5 human relationships, or the 6 arts, or filial piety. By contrast, the Yellow Emperor established institutional structures, such as the well-field system, that guided individuals to practice those skills necessary to produce social and political order, indirectly encouraging them to pursue their own self-interest rather than directly teaching them or providing them with moral instruction. So Li's emphasis on profit, right, his qualified praise of Lord Shang, and his unqualified admiration for the Yellow Emperor and Laozi offer a stark contrast to the Confucian ideal of producing social and political order by transforming the people through moral education, right? Indeed, Li concludes his essay, or at least he sets up this opposition, I believe, in the piece. Indeed, Li concludes his essay with the lesson drawn from the Tao Te Ching that the way of the sage does not consist in enlightening the people, but in keeping them ignorant. So, yet I don't think that Li is criticizing the Confucian ideal of ethical cultivation itself here, but rather is challenging the idea that political order is dependent on such ethical cultivation, right? And I think we can kind of broaden this theme when we look to the correspondence with Gongding Shang, right? Because there he further, as I'll go on to hopefully suggest, that the hierarchical political structure imagined within Confucian political thought provides a poor framework for effectively promoting such ethical cultivation, right? There's just kind of basic background about this exchange, right? Li Zhi had lived in the house of Gongding Shang and his brother Gongding Li in Macheng. The first letter that Li Zhi writes to Gongding Shang is been dated to 1584. It's written on the occasion of Gongding Li's death, right? And also revolves around Gongding Shang's decision to re-enter public service, right? And this first essay sets up, I think, an important theme that kind of pervades the entirety of their correspondence. And that is this kind of tension or comparison between the way in which ethical cultivation is fostered and nourished within the context of a more egalitarian relationship like friendship, and the way that the kind of hierarchical political structure that Lee sees as kind of representative of his socio-political times, right, actually impedes the possibility of such ethical cultivation, right? So one of the things that Lee first worries about with Gungding Li is dead, Gungding Shang is leaving, it's like, how am I going to pursue my ethical cultivation when my friends are leaving me, right? He asks who's going to mold him, right? He likens his, this is a great, he's, you know, quite fond of both regular bragging and humble brags, right? But he likens his relationship with Ding Li to that of Yan Hui and Confucius, right? He doesn't claim that he's Confucius, just Confucius's best student, of course, right? But he also criticizes Gungding Shang, right, for his decision to re-enter public service, right? And he writes in the translation of Timothy Brooke that to study and not seek friends, rather than seeking friends and not devoting oneself to finding someone greater than oneself, is unbearable. You may call willingly submitting yourself to service to the realm an expression of your love of learning, but I don't believe it. You wish to become something of great use, to be a great man, all while calling this great learning, but is this something you can achieve, right? So he immediately kind of casts doubt on the possibility that Gung can kind of harmonize his supposed desire to cultivate himself ethically while serving in political office, while also kind of contrasting what Gung will be able to do in political office with what they were supposedly able to achieve, right, within the kind of context of friendship within the home, right? So just how one ought to pursue learning is the subject of Lee's next letter, in which he raises the issue of what it means to learn from someone else by examining Confucius's role as a teacher. Lee begins examining Gung's question from a previous letter, that is, how can study be without a method? While he notes that these words are excellent, right, and indeed come from Confucius himself, he proceeds to question the role that Confucius's words should play in one's own process of studying and learning. Writing that these are Confucius's words, not ours, he chastises Gung for following them blindly. When an individual is born, Lee asserts, he already has functionality or yong, and he does not need the words of Confucius to become complete, zu. So if that were the case, then it would have been impossible for anyone born before Confucius to have become a complete person. So at first glance, it appears that Lee is simply denying the usefulness of cultivating oneself through the study of Confucius and the Analects. Yet, as in the Bing Shi Lun, Lee proceeds to creatively reread the Analects to develop an alternative account of what it might mean to learn from Confucius, right? So he starts by insisting that Confucius never told anyone to learn from Confucius, right? And in fact, part of his evidence of this is that when Yan Wei asked Confucius about Shen, he replied that becoming benevolent depends on oneself and not on others, right? And since benevolence comes from oneself, the students of Confucius actually didn't need to ask Confucius about benevolence in the first place. And since one always acts for oneself, he argues, Confucius actually had no method to pass on to his students, right? Insofar as he did have a method, Lee argues, that this method depended on there being neither self nor other, right? And so in his notes to the text, Zhang Jianye explains this idea, and I think this is persuasive given the context, this idea of there being no self or other, that the idea that there is no other signifies neither following others nor accepting the restraints imposed by others, whereas the idea that there is no self indicates neither stubbornly holding on to one's opinions nor wanting to impose oneself or on others, right? And so by interpreting Confucius's method as depending on there being neither self nor other, he is thus claiming that Confucius kind of neither imposed his views on his students, nor did he instruct others to follow him. And he concludes this passage by echoing Analects 2.1, right, by suggesting that Confucius's method, right, illustrates that when the sage occupies the highest position, the 10,000 things find their proper places and everything follows as it should. Again, where others might interpret this passage as the sage becomes, right, virtuous, and it's that virtue that is kind of shining throughout the world and is mirrored and gets people kind of wants people to agglomerate themselves, right, or follow the sage. Lee is kind of almost taking this passage and arguing kind of quite the opposite, right? That they're following as they should precisely because they're not following in a certain way, right? So as this passage also indicates, Lee connects his claim that Confucius never instructed anyone to learn from Confucius to the creation of a harmonious social and political order. At the same time, and echoing his argument in On Weapons and Food, Lee contends that what disturbs this social and political order is the attempt on the part of so-called benevolent men to directly impose it from above. If the sage's non-action leads everyone to find their proper place, they lose their places when benevolent men trouble them, right, and try to force them into what their supposed places are, right? So he says, accordingly, they use virtuous conduct, these supposedly benevolent men, and ritual to restrain their minds and administrate punishments to constrain their bodies, right? Only then do people really begin to lose their way. And here I think Lee is doing something kind of a little bit, again, an interesting kind of admission from the text, whereas if you look at, right, Analects 2.1, right, there's this contrast between using ritual, right, and using punishment. And Lee is just saying using ritual and using punishment, both of these things are bad. You do this, people start to lose their way, right? So if the practice, right, if Lee less worries that the enforcement of virtuous conduct from above cannot but inhibit its development, the practice of benevolence does indeed come from oneself, then it's crucial to allow others the space to develop the virtue of benevolence. And if, as Lee suggests throughout his selection of the passages from the Analects on benevolence in these exchanges, the virtue of benevolence manifests itself in distinct ways in different individuals, then allowing other such space is also crucial for allowing such distinct manifestations of benevolence to develop, right? So this practice of self-restraint stands in direct contrast to Geng Dingchang's understanding of the Confucian tradition and his role as a public minister, at least as it's presented by Lee in the correspondence. As Lee observes, the people and things of the realm are so numerous. If you desire them all to act according to your own kind of method, then the world would certainly not be able to manage it. This one-size-fits-all approach that Lee argues constitutes Geng's understanding of Confucius's method may work in some cases, but will inevitably fail in others. Rather, the sage, in attempting to produce social and political order, must accommodate himself to the desires and skills of individuals. Lee thus concludes the letter by applying this lesson to the context of Geng's public service and their personal friendship. While Geng can and does earnestly put into practice his method of learning, Lee reminds him that not everyone is the same as him. And while Lee might respect Geng as an individual and respect his devotion to his method, that does not mean that he must be just like him. Okay, so by way of conclusion, I just wanted to kind of reflect a little bit on a passage that Pauline Lee penned towards the end of her manuscript on the Confucianism and the virtue of desire. She argues, right, that one might wish that Li Zhi had a more developed interest in an understanding of the role of social structures, such as institutions and modes of social organization, or even technology and science, play in dampening and fettering, or liberating and nurturing our native sense for genuine self-expression. And so while I think she is certainly correct that Li Zhi does not imagine new socio-political structures that would liberate or nurture our desires for genuine self-expression, the foregoing analysis hopefully suggests some of the ways in which his writings do reflect on the way in which the inegalitarian socio-political structures of his day did fetter such self-expression. Lee's solution to this problem, that those who are concerned with ethical cultivation ought to retreat from the political realm, right, is certainly an apolitical one, right? Yet for those interested in developing a Confucian conception of democracy, these writings may offer an imminent critique of the relationship between ethics and politics as it is traditionally conceived within Confucianism, even if it comes from someone who is rather unorthodox in his Confucianism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Philip, would you like to give your comments?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you, John, for your very interesting paper. You basically presented us with two different kinds of sort of writings by Li Zhi from his collection Von Schul. The one being an essay, and the others being part of his correspondence with his various acquaintances, friends and foes alike. This essay, being Shilun, is like many of the writings of Li Zhi, I think, heavily understudied. There's not very much scholarship in the West concerning Li Zhi in such detail. I think one of the major aspects, both in the essay that you presented here, that you analyzed here, and in his correspondence with Geng Dingxiang, is the aspect of historical relativity. So this historical relativism that Li Zhi argues for, not only in here, but also in many of his other writings on historical topics, on historical personalities, especially on Confucius and on Confucianism, but also on Taoism and on Buddhism, is, and you mentioned it at some point, is that Li Zhi cautions his contemporaries that are, his circle of friends were all sort of coming from the same direction, from the Wang Yangming school of thought. Some of them were students of Wang Ji, and they were associated with the Taizhou school. So they all had this sort of leftist, sort of revolutionary stance when looking at, historical figures, historical writings, Confucianism, the syncretism of their time, and so on. So one thing that he mentioned is that the problem with the current orthodoxy is that the scholars that are studying Confucius, that are studying other historical thinkers, are trying to emulate these people, and they're trying to emulate the way they argue, the way they, the whole system, or the whole worldview on how to be an ethical person, on how to be a moral person, on how to become a junzi, is historically grounded in the times they lived in. And so it is impractical and useless for Li Zhi himself and his contemporaries, because they live in different times. So the presumptions of Confucius don't necessarily apply to the realities of the present day. Neither, by the way, do his assumptions for people of future generations. He says that as well at some point. So I think this is one critical point that you touched upon that is really important when reading Li Zhi, especially his critical writings about history, but also about philosophy, where he talks. There's this one passage from the Von Schul where he talks about Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, all three of them being harmful to the development of the state, being harmful to the development of each individual, because they sort of inhibit by, as you said, with a top-down approach, by teaching people how to be moral, how to be upright, how to be become a junzi, how to become the ideal man. What it does, it sort of hinders, it sort of destroyed the innate qualities. And one of these innate qualities, he called this innate knowledge. This comes also from Wang Yangming, Liangzhi, the good knowledge that you have in your original nature, in your original heart. Benxin in Chinese is the childlike mind, or the childlike heart, the tongxin. And this tongxin goes away the more you study the teachings, for example, by Confucius, because they are not really meant for you and for the times you live in. So I think this is one point that is worthwhile to think about when talking about how Li Zhi argues for the disconnection between, or the disconnection of of political order and ethical order. But on the other hand, he does sort of argue for an egalitarian society by saying that everyone, every person, every man, every woman, born high or low, has the Buddha nature in themselves, the Forxing, and this Forxing enables everyone to become, you know, sort of this either enlightened Buddhist personality, or in a Confucian way, some variation of the Junzi. So I think this is important with regard to this. When talking about his correspondence, if you look at the Funshu, 1/3 of the Funshu consists of his correspondence. So the first 2 chapters of the Funshu is his letters with various people. Gongding Xiang is a very interesting correspondence partner because I wouldn't really classify him as a friend. While Gongding Li surely was, together with a couple of others, one of Li's closest acquaintances, and maybe for a time Gongding Li died relatively young, one of the closest and most important relations that he had with among his peers. He had a very difficult and not very close relationship with his family and with his superiors, and he was a bit of a, I think, a bit of a difficult character. But in Gongding Li, he found somebody who was, you know, who was like-minded, and he stayed with Gongding Li and Gongding Xiang in Macheng for a certain amount of time. And when after Gongding Li died, the relationship between Gongding Xiang and Li Zhi really soured, so that Gongding Xiang made Li Zhi move out of his house because he was, as Gongding Xiang said, corrupting his sons and his family with his thoughts. So that, and Li Zhi moved on to become a monk and live in a monastery in Macheng. Because I'm saying that because you also alluded to the topic of friendship. And friendship among the 5 relations of traditional Confucian societal roles, for him the most important relationship is the one among friends. And friendship is this one essay from the Funshu on friendship, where he says that he's longing to find the one friend, the one person that understands him. And so this sort of egalitarian and equal relationship is the one that Li Zhi favors most, not only personally for him in his dealings with his peers, but as some sort of societal ideal. So this sort of you know, eye-to-eye relationship between 2 friends is something that Li Zhi values much more than the more, you know, hierarchical relationships between, you know, the ruler and the ruled, and you know, father and son and so on. So I think this is something that is essential to keep in mind when talking about this these sort of texts by Li Zhi. And yeah, I think that is my rather long-wound comment on your paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. So since we are a little bit over time, I would like to ask if there are some questions that you would like to ask John Lombardini, so that we can wrap up before we take a small break and then have our second keynote lecture for today. Anyone would like to ask something? Okay, I don't see any urgent questions, so maybe John, you would like to address Philip's comment.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much for those very detailed comments. Yeah, I mean, I think that, right, I think what's a very interesting kind of, I wouldn't describe it necessarily as a tension, but the way in which think Pauline Lee argues that, right, if we think about his model of self-cultivation, it's a kind of preservation model versus the kind of discovery model of someone like Wang Yongming. And that, right, the problem is that for Wang Yongming, we do still need to eliminate our selfish desires. And if we eliminate our selfish desires, we can kind of discover that in a Buddha nature that it's there, right? But for Li Zhi, once he kind of valorizes or kind of revalues our selfish desires as having a kind of positive valence, right? Then really what it becomes is kind of preserving what's already there from these kind of societal influences that are going kind of take us away from our original childlike heart mind, right? And so it almost kind of from the start is figured that many of our kind of social actions are going to be things that are dangerous, right? If our ultimate goal is to kind of preserve our childlike heart mind, right? But at the same time, he views friendship as a possible kind of relationship with another, right? That can actually promote and nurture and help to flourish our kind of preservation of that heart mind, right? Almost against, right, these other kinds of societal structures that impede upon it, right? And I will take your point about the kind of historical relativism as well. Especially right in the essay in the preface to the historical the table of contents in the Zangshu, right? He talks about how, right, that judgments of Shifei have always kind of changed over time and they've never remained settled or constant, right? And there again, he seems to do something interesting where on the one hand, it seems like everyone is just parroting the judgments of Confucius about what is Shifei. And it's not necessarily that Confucius, there's anything wrong with Confucius itself, but it's the way that people have interpreted and followed and kind of appealed to the authority of Confucius that seems problematic. At least that's what I find interesting about the way he treats Confucius in some of these essays in the Fen Shu, is that he's almost kind of arguing that Confucius was doing the same kind or understood education almost in the same way that he does, right? And that later Confucians misunderstood this as kind of by thinking about the relationship between teacher and student in too hierarchical a way, right? And there's that, I forget which essay it is, where he's talking about the relationship between the teacher and student and the friend that they're actually the same thing, right? And part of the mistake is to think that they ought to be distinct. Right? But thank you so much.
So thank you so much, John. And then I suggest that we take a small and well-deserved break before our keynote lecture.